Good afternoon. My name is Clara Louisa McClure, and I am the wife of Tipton Fester McClure. Our monument is right over there. We were married in Benson in 1885. The following year, we moved to Litchfield, where my husband served as the station master for the Great Northern Railroad. In 1891, he assisted in the organization of the Bank of Litchfield. His name and experience with the railroad showed the bank's investors they were wise in selecting him. He served as cashier and then as president until his retirement in 1935. This is the picture of the bank, and it was called the Bank of Litchfield. Later on, it became the First Bank of Litchfield, of which he also was president. Tipton was very involved in the community. Some of the more notable enterprises that he assisted with advice and credit were the Litchfield Cooperative Creamery and nearly every cooperative creamery outside of Litchfield in this county. He organized the first local telephone system, which was eventually sold to Tri-State and Northwestern Bell. In 1909, he was one of the incorporators of the Litchfield Hospital and of the first local oil company. In 1890, Tipton had a new home built for his family at 215 South Sibley Avenue. And here's a picture of it, and it is still in existence. We have 6 living children, 2 sons, Howard and Leslie, and 4 daughters, Grace, Jessie, Ethel, and Marjorie. Our eldest daughter, Florence, died at 15 of heart failure. Tipton and I are very active members in the Presbyterian Church. I am a member of the Women's Literary Club and of the Musical Club. In 1910, I was diagnosed with spinal cancer and bedridden. I died at my home in 1912. I was 44 years old. Tipton then married Martha Fullerton in 1914. Martha had graduated from Litchfield High School in 1904 and from Carleton College, Northfield, in 1908. She was a teacher for several years before her marriage. Tipton and Martha had 1 daughter, Margaret, in 1920. These are pictures of their family. This is John and his wife Carrie. This is Florence. This is Grace and her family. This picture was taken in 1930. This is Jessie, Ethel. This is Leslie. And I know this is Margaret and her husband. Leslie served in World War I, and Margaret's husband served in World War II. This is Margaret, and this is Marjorie. Thank you.
I'm Mike, and I'm portraying Nels Anderson. Now, Nels Anderson was born in 1854, a long time before you guys, huh? Even before me, actually. I was born, well, 90 years after he was, okay? Anyway, I was born in Sweden. How I get to Litchfield, there isn't much on that information. I have an uncle who's here by the name of Andy Anderson, and Andy, he owns the local blacksmith shop on East 3rd Street. So anyway, in 1890, I buy my own blacksmith shop. Now, whether I work for Andy or not, that isn't clear. Mine is on East Depot Street, and I run my blacksmith shop from 1890 to 1922. Now, I'm a bachelor. I have never get married, have no children. At my funeral, there's only nieces and nephews mentioned. So where my father and mother are, probably still in the old country. I am known for my being a Mason, and I went through their degrees. While I was a Knights Templar too. Okay, there was a local group here. They died out sometime after I joined, and they moved to Wilmer, where there was a bigger group of population. And that's the last we know of the Templars being here locally. The Masons are still here. There's still all kinds of philanthropic things that they do. In other words, they help different organizations within the community. I am known as a traveler, and a traveler is a group within the Masons. I went to every state and went to at least one lodge there between 1922 and 1926 when I passed away from cancer. Okay, and what that meant was that I would go and be at one of their meetings. They would sign a little booklet for me, and then I'd go to the next one. I also traveled in Europe and did the same thing in some of the old Mason temples. I died of cancer, as I say. This big monument over here, the one that kind of looks like a tree, that was donated by me after I sold my business to the Masons. And I got to get buried there, and then any other Mason that wanted to get buried there could be buried there. It also was any Mason who couldn't afford to get buried, okay? And that's my story.
Good afternoon on this nice balmy day. I'm going to be talking about a couple of the doctors, early doctors in Litchfield. First one is Dr. G.A.C. Cutts, and this is the family plot here. His parents actually were the early settlers in Forest City in the 1850s. And his father served as a state senator, so they were prominent people. He was born on the 27th of July, 1876. His name was George Armstrong Custer Cutts. He went to the University of Minnesota, graduated from medicine there, and his first place he served was actually in Grove City. And he was there until, I don't know exactly when, sometime after 1900 he moved to Litchfield, and then he was in practice with the Dr. Chapman here. But apparently he was a very well-liked man. Both these doctors were, the other one I'm going to be talking about. But he had, as an adult, he had a heart condition, and that plagued him for several years, and his health just slowly declined. But he practiced medicine up until 10 days before he died from heart failure. And they said that to show how well he was respected in life, that they said in the paper that his funeral procession to the cemetery was over half a mile long. And so he was a guy that was very well respected and thought a lot about. The other doctor here, Dr. Cutts, I should say, I don't know if he's buried here in the family plot or not. I see no headstone, so he may be buried someplace else in the cemetery here. But Dr. Castle, the other one I'm going to talk about, and that's why we did it, set it up this way, is that big one you see on the other side of the pine tree there. And that's Dr. Henry E. Castle. He was born in Sweden in 1859. He came to America at age 23, which would put him about 1882 here in Minnesota. He too went to the University of Minnesota, took some courses down there to get certified to be a physician here in 1883. His first stop was Cokato, and then Dassel, and then finally here to Litchfield. Now he was a really well-known surgeon. He was a gifted surgeon One of the articles I looked at talked about him. They had a Swedish hospital down in Minneapolis would contact him, and he would come down there to do the really complicated surgeries that they needed done. He was a gifted surgeon. Dr. Danielson here in town would sometimes go down with him and assist, but he was a gifted surgeon and pretty well known in the area in central Minnesota. The article talks about him. He's kind of a bit of a character. That he had a really gift for humor, wit, really witty, and a gift for sarcasm too. And he had an expression that he used quite a bit. It's called Christomighty. And what they talked about him being the positive things. And then they said, well, but he was a gourmet, a glutton, and a connoisseur of brandy. And they said that to the point that he was the equal of Henry VIII in England. The only difference was that Dr. Castle just had one wife. He was known to supposedly facing a really difficult surgery to have a half a tumbler of brandy before he operated. He was a huge man. He weighed over 300 pounds. And they said that when he first got here, it was horse and buggy. And so he hired a guy to drive him around. But when automobiles came out, he was one of the first guys to purchase an automobile. And back in those days, those first ones didn't have a steering wheel. They had a steering bar. And he couldn't sit behind it. He had to sit over here and steer it from the passenger side because he wouldn't fit behind it. And one account that it talks about is he was coming into a curve and he took it too fast or didn't handle it right and ended up flipped the car over in a marsh on top of him. And passerby came up, helped him out, and his response was, "Christomighty, you're going to watch me drown?" And but he also had a lot of friends, a lot of male friends, and one of them asked him one time, "Doctor, how much do you weigh?" And his response was, "Christomighty, you a cattle buyer?" And then they also told a story about him being in a grocery store in town here, and somebody came in with an infected finger and come up to him and they said, "What should I do with this?" And his response was, "Val, I would go see a good doctor." But like I said, he was a bit of a character, but he was a well-known surgeon, and he was instrumental. He's one of the doctors that instrumental in getting a hospital here, and he was a stockholder in the hospital. Also, and one of the main surgeons, and he actually, in performing surgery in 1911 on somebody, he pricked his finger with an instrument when he was in surgery and got infected. And he went down to the cities, Minneapolis, to a doctor down there, and I suppose specialized in that type of thing. And at first they thought they were going to have to amputate his hand. But they didn't. He seemed to be getting better. His wife was down there with a full-time nurse, and one day they went shopping. They'd been in there around him, and they just said, "Well, he's doing better, go shopping." And well, they were gone. He died from septicemia. And they got back, and they said his wife was just prostrate afterwards, just went to pieces, and she died the next year, 1912. And the article said that her clothes had gasoline on them and they caught on fire, and so there's some speculation she may have killed herself. We don't know for sure if it was an accident or otherwise, but they were both really well liked and really prominent in the early medicine here in Litchfield.
My name is Raymond Dart, although I would be honored if you would simply call me Ray. We, by some trick of science or curse of sorcery, or perhaps blessing, are standing at this moment upon the grave where my mortal body is interred. I lived most of my life here in Litchfield. I arrived in 1884 and I departed in 1970. And during that time, I became a well-known barrister and solicitor at law. And after some time in that profession, I ascended to the bench. I owe you an apology for wearing the reflecting glasses that are on my face and that my mother has kindly inscribed with my name. I, as a young child, lost the gift of sight in what can only properly be called a corset incident. My mother was an abundant woman, not blessed with wealth, but beset by a certain pleasant corpulence, and keeping all of her bodice in place required a fair amount of structural pressure. And when some of that structural pressure became unwound, I was hit in the face with a flying whalebone, and that ended my windows to the soul. Undaunted, I continued my studies as a child with my mother, perhaps out of guilt, reading from my textbooks directly to me. I never learned Braille. As a child, I thought my fingers were better suited to other things, and including keeping my lip abundantly full of chewing tobacco. By the time I was at university, I had found some other people to read my textbooks aloud to me, and by the time I was in law school at the University of Minnesota, at Patty Hall, my wife was reading aloud to me from my texts. I became quite well known as a courtroom litigator after trying my first case, as one might say, blind. I became somewhat famous or infamous for my ability to always hit the spittoon, which raised some questions about the completeness of my blindness. I have in my dotage converted over to a different method of obtaining the wonderful health benefits of the golden leaf. I have brought a selection of my favorite chewing tobacco along for your consumption. Help yourself in order that you begin this wonderful indulgence as early in your life as you are able. In the early 30s, I decided to spend some of my not inconsiderable lawyer earnings on an automobile, and my loyal wife would accompany me wherever I went. I was known to the local police, so that I rarely was hassled by them, and she would be my eyes.
How many accidents did you have?
I had no accidents. But as some other gentlemen have observed, having your wife in the car is the equivalent to having another driver in the car, and what she would do is watch out ahead. I would work the brake and the clutch and the accelerator in the middle of the wheel, and when I got too far off to the right, she'd say, "Ray," and when I got too far off to the left, she'd say, "Jesus," and I found I could negotiate the streets of Litchfield quite easily just by remaining between Ray and Jesus. Well, I'm pleased to make your acquaintance and to have had this opportunity to speak with you from the grave. He was born in Sweden. His parents came to Red Wing when he was a year and a half old. He was apparently a natural musician. He started 15 bands in Minnesota. The last one being a cornet band here in 1885. It continued concerts in the park every Saturday night, and the band was organized in town before there was a constable. So we had a municipal band before we had any municipal police force. Apparently, if you have a good enough band, you don't need any cops.
I'm not sure that works that way, but they called him Music Ole because there were a good number of Ole Olsons in town. So it got a little confusing when the wives got together to talk about their husbands. They had to know which one was which, so it was Music Ole and Feed Store Ole and Grocery Ole and Fisherman Ole and I don't remember how many others. And other than that, he started the band. He had a music store, which is somewhere between the Parkview Grill, their patio, and partially over into the courthouse. Not exactly sure exactly where it was. It's a little hard to tell in the pictures. There's a cigar factory there and a candy store, but he sold player pianos and music, sheet music, and all kinds of musical instruments. He provided the musical instruments for all the youth in the schools and surrounding areas. Was quite well known and quite well respected as far as I can tell. There is a little picture of him here with the cornet band, and I believe up, I think there are, I'm trying to remember where it is now, there's a picture of the band hanging, marching with his, that he's marching, a note that he's marching with it, but I don't remember where it hangs. I'm sure there's one at the Historical Society, but one of the businesses. He would not have seen it. But you may have heard it.
I never saw such a picture.
But you may have heard of where it is.
I heard him many times.
Yes, yeah. He would have driven there. Yes.
Smelled the band.
Yes, and yes, he probably did not yield for the band. That he may have been the reason they had to get a constable before the band disbanded. But anyway, that is all I know about Music Ole. And I don't. He had children here. One of his grandchildren, apparently, they gave me a little sheet which is a transcription of conversations between a couple of people. Joy and Gary were grandchildren, I believe, of his. Found his original instrument. He played a alto horn, I think, and he was a violinist with a paralyzed ring finger, which had to have been quite an accomplishment. I played fiddle a little bit, and I couldn't do it without that finger. But apparently he had some way of keeping it out of the way, at least. But he was one of the Ole Olsons in town.
I am Albert DeLong, early pioneer in Meeker County, Indian Scout, member of the 9th Minnesota Regiment during the Civil War and Indian Wars, hence the Civil War uniform. A little bit about my early history, and then kind of the highlight of my life, which really happened when I was in my early 20s. But I was born in 1842 to Hiram and Maria DeLong in New York State. When I was 7, the family moved to Wisconsin and farmed there. I farmed with my father, and then when I was 17, we moved to Minnesota and homesteaded in Ellsworth and Greenleaf Township. And I then struck out on my own after farming with my father for a short time. I started a flour mill at the outlet of Cedar Lake. We called it the Cedar Mill. That was my profession. I was a miller, flour miller. Worked with a neighbor named Vincent Combs, and we were working at my mill one hot August day, August 18th, 1862, when a messenger came up and said that there had been an outbreak with the Indians and that people were being killed by Acton. And so Mr. Combs and I got on our horses and rode to Acton to see what had happened there. When we got to Acton, we discovered a party of citizens were there, led by a man named Ole Halverson Ness, who lived southwest of here, just to the south of what is now Ness Church. Acton, of course, from where I stand, is about 10 miles directly to the west. We saw the assemblage of men there, and there were 5 bodies lined up. 3 men, a woman, and a 15-year-old girl who had been killed the day before, August 17th, by 4 young Indians, Dakotas, who had been on a hunting trip, who were frustrated by the lack of fulfillment of the treaty obligations, and they killed the 5. And the next day then, on August 18th, I wasn't aware of it, but there was big fighting going on in the lower and upper Sioux agencies. The war was on. In those first days, 250 white immigrant families and people killed in the Minnesota River Valley. But on August 18th, I wasn't aware of all of that. It was what to do. We built boxes, coffins for the 5. They would be taken to the present Ness Church Cemetery and buried there. I rode back, first doing a little reconnoitering around the area. We saw a band of Indians nearby. We chased them on horseback. We chased them all the way to Lake Lillian. And there, the Indians turned and in a wooded area started to fire at us. We, being more out in the open, decided basically the better part of valor was not to attack, because they had the good ground for fighting, and we left. So we rode back to Hutchinson. And in Hutchinson, we spread the word of what was happening there, and then it became, what do we do now? Well, how widespread is this? And then word started coming in about the killings of the upper and lower Sioux. And then an Indian man named John Otherday approached, because we had gone at first to Cedar Lake, and we were on a point at Cedar Lake. We thought that we'd be safe there from any Indian attack. John Otherday came and told us that the Indians would simply swim around, and we were in a very unsafe position. Otherday had 32 that he had brought with him, white employees mostly from the Upper Sioux Agency. So John Otherday, the Indian, rescued 32 whites on that first day of the uprising. Then we decided we'd go back to Hutchinson and build a stockade, which we did. I then was sent out as a messenger, as a scout with others in the area, on my horse. Eventually, the 9th Minnesota Regiment under Captain Richard Strout marched into this area. They were here to try to quell any disturbances in this area, and there were people being killed, more in Meeker County. The idea was for me to lead Strout's men and take them to Forest City. Forest City was the metropolis of Meeker County at that time. It was the county seat. There was no Litchfield. There might have been a collection of homes around here, but this was called Ness Town in 1862. So, I am with Richard Strout. We camp at Acton on the night of September 2nd, 1862. We camp at the homestead of Robinson Jones, one of the 5 who had been killed. And there, we expected a peaceful night. At 3 in the morning, 3 horsemen rode in. And the horsemen, coming from Forest City, were surprised that there weren't even any guards posted at Strout's camp. And they said, "What are you doing? There are Indians all over. We've been sent to tell you that there are Indians here and that there is an imminent attack coming." Well, at that point, Strout ordered his men to ready themselves for an attack. First thing they found is that their .58 caliber rifle bullets didn't fit the rifles. They were too big. So we had to sit down and, with our knives, slice the bullets so they would fit the rifles. The next morning, Strout orders us to march out, and it's been decided now we're going to go to Hutchinson, not to Forest City. I am put out 600 yards in the lead. It's my job to be the scout, the lookout, to lead them. We go directly to the east to where now is Long Lake south of Grove City. And there's a road along the west side of Long Lake, and we ride to it. I am out in front, 600 yards, and we see in the distance, I see, in a wheat field, a glint in the sunlight. What is it? It has to be the sun shining on a rifle. And so I rush back to Captain Strout and tell him that there are a band of Indians in the distance. And then we see an Indian stand up on a fence post, waving a blanket, signaling. It will be discovered he is Little Crow. He is signaling to another band who will attack us from the rear. Little Crow's band fires. We form a line on the road, firing back. 44 soldiers. And the Indians surround us. Well, technically, they are on three sides. They're pushing us back into the lake. So there we are, the lake behind us, Indians coming on three sides, firing. 3 are dead, 21 are wounded of our men. At that point, we decide there's only one way out. Fix bayonets and charge through the Indians, gaining the road again that we've been pushed off. And that is what we did. Then once on the road, we rush down the south to the south. There are 8 wagons that we have. 5 of us are on horseback. I am on horseback. Most of the men are running. We get to the end of the Long Lake where we stop and reconnoiter. What should we do? There's various options. We can stand and fight. Or we could give up. Well, neither of those seemed like a good idea. The third option, run to Hutchinson, became the most logical thing to do. And so, to escape, we ran off. Now, how do we outrun them? Well, we had 8 wagons, all packed full of goods. Periodically along the way, we would throw the goods out of the wagons. The Indians would stop to go through everything, and then we would gain some more distance. And that's how we got to Hutchinson, where they did, just as we got there, they were behind us. They killed 2 women and 1 child, but the stockade had been constructed, and the rest of the people in the town got into the stockade, and we held the Indians at bay. Meanwhile, on September 4th, the Indians had divided, and the other group under Little Crow had gone to Forest City. On the morning of September 4th, they attacked there. And once again, well, they were very surprised. The fort hadn't been there on September 2nd. It was built on the day of September 3rd. Luckily, there's a church that was being constructed, and they had all the logs already, so they could simply take them. But the attack happened in the early morning of September 4th. The Indians were driven away. For the next several weeks, until the end of September, war rages in Minnesota, in the River Valley. Nearly 800, mostly white immigrants, are killed. And then at the Battle of Wood Lake, General Sibley fights his final battle against Little Crow and defeats him, and the war in Minnesota is over. But the next year, 1863, it is my task to be a scout in the 9th Minnesota for General Sibley. And we continue off into the Dakota Territory trying to punish the Indians for the war in Minnesota. And so we fight at the Battle of Big Mound. We fight at Dead Buffalo Lake. They're very ingenious in the names they came up with for these battles. There's a dead buffalo by the lake, so the Dead Buffalo Lake battle. And another battle on Whitewater Lake. We pushed the Indians all the way to the Missouri River and across the river. We were supposed to have met up with General Sully coming up from Iowa. He wasn't there. He'd been delayed by low water in the Missouri River. And so, General Sibley decided, that's it. We fought some battles, we pushed them off into the west of the Missouri. Sully's not here, we're going home. And we did. Via Fort Abercrombie and then back to Fort Snelling. Meanwhile, Sully did show up, and he was a very serious Indian fighter. Not quite the political general that Sibley was. And Sully took care of the Indians pretty handily at Whitestone Hill, and then later on at Killdeer Mountain in 1864. Meanwhile, I'm back home again after the Sibley expedition, and so I turn once again to my mill at Cedar Mill, and then after that went busted, I went off into the Black Hills for 3 years. Then I came back to Minnesota and I farmed. And then, being I guess flour milling, sawmilling was in my blood, I bought some mills by Manana and Forest City and continued to work as a miller. And then I moved back to Litchfield, which was now a booming city. Forest City no longer the county seat. And here in Litchfield I remained the rest of my life until I became infirm. I was, well, in my 90s when my son Frank took me to Hutchinson, where I died just short of my 93rd birthday. Brought back here, had a Masonic ceremony, and interred right over there by that flag. With my wife, Mary. Not exactly sure why out of my 3 wives I'm next to Mary, but that's the way things wound up. I had 3 wives that all passed away before I did. And really only one surviving heir when I died, and that was my son Frank. So, that is the story of Albert DeLong.
Going back 4 generations is William Daniel Kruger. He came over from Prussia when he was about 30 years old. And his wife Carolyn came with. And we always thought that Lenore was William's mother, but it turns out that it's probably Carolyn's mother. So this is why we're all buried here. The others were some of the other children who died when they were younger. All these peoples were buried at the farm south of Litchfield and then moved here in about 1920. The Krugers have been in this area since the 1850s, bought land in 1862 for $1.25 an acre. That year also there was the Indian uprising, so they ended up spending a portion of the fall and early winter in the stockade up in Forest City. So my great-great-great-grandfather William and his sons and daughters were there. My great-great-grandfather Henry was about 7 years old at the time. He had several sons, Carl, Bill, and Herman, who all lived in and around Lake Minnabell, south of town. They all had sections of the lake, so at one point about half of Lake Minnabell was Kruger's. They farmed there. William's brother also farmed in that area, Greenleaf and Ellsworth Township. They farmed about 500 acres at one point, which back at that time was a lot of acreage to farm. Henry had several children. Herman was my grandfather. He used to be the mobile oil dealer here in town, right where the laundromat is now. Is where his station was. Okay. Well, thank you.
Hello and welcome to the Litchfield Cemetery Tour. My name is Aiden Burby.
And I'm Abby Toma. We play the three nameless kids who lived in Litchfield in the 1920s.
I'm Quentin Burby. The newspaper account did not give the names of the children playing in the cemetery. Well, we would come to the cemetery and play. You see over there? The cemetery man owned the land, but he did not need it for graveyards yet. So he rented it out to some man who kept sheep there. The sheep would cut down the grass, so then they didn't have to pay for mowing. Then they sold the wool for some money to keep up the cemetery.
Some years they would plant flakes in the unused parts of the cemetery and sell them. The money helped, and the men took good care of the cemetery, and we did not want to mess up anything.
So one hot August day, it was very hot and had been for this for a few weeks.
Yes, we were playing and we noticed a man sitting over there by the trees. He was sitting funny, like not quite sitting or leaning against the tree.
I pointed him out and asked if he was the same man that was sitting there 2 weeks ago.
I said it was, and he was sitting in the same spot, in the same position.
I said we should go over there and make sure he was okay.
So we started walking over there.
Yep, we thought he could maybe talk to him. We never see anyone playing out here while we're playing.
Well, sometimes we see Willie the Digger. He's the man who lives downtown and digs the graves.
We don't want to hang out when Willie's digging.
So we were walking over there, and when we got closer, we could smell something really bad.
It was bad.
Yep, it was sure bad. I said, doesn't he look all swollen up?
Well, that's when we thought, boy, we better get help. So we ran downtown and told the constable.
He came right away and said the man was dead. Like, really dead.
Then he wanted to talk to us. He wanted to know what we had seen because he was not sure if it was a murder or a suicide.
We told him the man was there 2 weeks ago when we were playing.
I told the constable he was sitting in the same position in the same spot 2 weeks ago.
So the constable looked into this matter. The man had identification on him, and he had been staying at the Litchfield House Hotel and checked out about a month ago. He was just passing through town.
No one talked to him since he left the hotel. People thought he moved on.
And the constable said he was known to drink, so he tried contacting the man's family and could not find anyone.
So the county buried him over in Potter's Field. The constable said it was a suicide because of the way he was sitting.
What is Potter's Field? Well, this started in the Bible, in the Old Testament. In areas where soil is clay, it was used for pottery by potters. After digging holes, the land could not be used for food, so the potters would bury people such as strangers, criminals, or even people that were poor.
The whole area is Potter's Field, and it was also a section for babies who died. There are some headstones there. Many graves had wooden crosses, which are now gone.
People are now buried where plot is open, but the area over there where the ribbons are, that is still Potter's Field. The association was almost bankrupt, and the bank was going to foreclose. Shares were sold to members for $1,000, and the cemetery was saved. During this time frame, an additional 15.75 acres were purchased. In 1930, plots were $430 each, with $1 for annual maintenance or $30 for perpetual care.
Before the lawnmowers, the Cemetery Association mowed the grass with a horse-drawn lawn mower. They paid $1 a day. The wool from the sheep brought in $34 a year. And now the city of Litchfield took over the cemetery in 1994. The flags flew for the first time in May 1985.